Okay, this is part 2 of our discussion of Han textbook chapter 2, our reading 4. And here we're going to begin somewhere around page 45, Understanding Culture-Bound Syndromes. And you will want to have your little handout handy. Hard to get it up there in front of the camera where I can see it. Anyway, so have that little handout handy. It's been loaded up for you on Moodle, so hopefully you have that with you. And it's a graphic illustration of the three different models we'll be talking about. First, we're going to focus on the exclusionist model, which is this top model. And let me get this in front of the camera here. This is not so easy to do. As you can see, perhaps not too clearly, here's the exclusionist model at the top. At the bottom, the continuum you see here is, let me get it, here we go. I think it's natural universal, natural biological. One more time. Alright, here we go. So natural biological over here and cultural over here. And according to the exclusionist model, all maladies or syndromes are either exclusively natural and biological or exclusively cultural, hence the X here and there. In other words, the only two places where culture-bound, well, where sicknesses can go, either at the strictly natural end or the strictly cultural end. And so therefore, in the exclusionist paradigm, the notion of a culture-bound syndrome actually does make sense. In other words, it is a viable category in the exclusionist way of thinking. Okay? All right. And it is probably this perspective, this exclusionist perspective, that is really given rise to this notion of a culture-bound syndrome, which is pretty much the kind of, I guess, popular way of thinking about sicknesses around the world. The idea of a culture-bound syndrome is very, very real to many people, although to anthropologists, not so much. So what's being implied here in this exclusionist sort of mentality, or this exclusionist approach, is that some sickness is amenable to empirical study, the sort of thing that scientists engage in, and that can be dealt with in the big building at the end of the road down there in the hospital. But yet other sicknesses are the concern of anthropology and psychology. In other words, they're cultural issues. So there's this sort of interesting kind of dichotomy, a division of labor, if you will, because of the way the exclusionist paradigm sees sickness. In your Han textbook, why don't you refer to page 45, and there's a quote here that is relevant for us. On page 45, we're reading from the second paragraph on the page. Okay? The exclusionist interpretation of culture-bound syndromes is suggested by the phrase culture-bound syndrome itself. The phrase implies or assumes that some conditions are culture-bound and others are not. Conditions that are not culture-bound may be regarded as culture-free, culture-blind. Perhaps they are thought of as nature, physiology, or materiality bound. In the exclusionist view, that a condition falls in one half of this divide implies that it does not fall in the other, and vice versa. By the way, that's why we use the term exclusionist for this approach. Lata and amok are culture-bound syndromes. Measles and lung cancer are not. This division is held to correspond to disciplinary divisions as well, so that culture-bound syndromes are the concern of anthropological and or psychological or psychiatric expertise, and culture-free syndromes are the subject of medical or physiological examination. So just a couple of comments there. Lata and amok are very popular culture-bound disorders. And just a few words on both of them. Lata is found primarily in Malaysia, Indonesia, that part of the world. And the behavior is very much like the sort of behavior you see associated with Tourette's syndrome. People have these uncontrollable tics, for example. Also, people have noted that it's similar to schizophrenia, even autism. So that's an example where people have noted the symptoms and so forth of the disorder and discovered that in fact it may just be a local manifestation of a more universal condition. Amok is also found in, well, I shouldn't say also, amok is found in the Philippines, and the word is just a Malay word for like just being out of control. And the symptoms are just this sort of very ebullient, uncontrollable behavior. Another point that was made there is that that maladies such as measles and I forget what the other one was that was mentioned, but measles, for example, would certainly in the exclusionist paradigm would fall at the strictly natural end. And you could probably think of some other things as well, tuberculosis. Whereas, obviously, Lata and amok would fall near, well, at the exclusively cultural end. Now, one of the problems, and here I've jumped past the other two models, and I've jumped towards page 50. Anthropological queries and logical doubts. I'll come back in a bit and catch the other two models, but this pertains almost exclusively to the exclusionist model. One of the problems with the exclusionist model, and assuming that many conditions are culture specific, is that it would make a scientific comparison impossible, because after all, you know, as the old adage goes, you can't compare apples and oranges. So, I mean, if there are apples and oranges in regard to sickness, we actually cannot compare them. But if you think about it, to get to a culture-bound syndrome, that requires contextualizing something in a very specific way. Because after all, with Lata, for example, if it is a local manifestation of Tourette's, well, there's a universal way to recognize that. But however, you know, if you get really cultural specific, you can make it look as if it's something very cultural, very specific. And the problem with contextualizing things like that is, where do we stop? You know, how specific do we make them? And there's a quote on page 52 that's relevant to that issue. So why don't you turn to page 52, please? And we'll start with, you see the paragraph that starts by contextualizing? Okay, start with the sentence above it. Do we then talk of community-bound, age-bound, person-bound, person times circumstance-bound syndromes? In other words, how specific do we get? By contextualizing in this way, we end up with a list of occurrences for persons at times and circumstances, and so on ad infinitum. Then, since each instance is unique, we could not compare. There would be no two instances of anything to compare. In such a perspective, it is not even clear how we talk of events in the first place, other than by specifically naming each one. Kinney writes of the problem of including too little in defining a category, so that we tend to ignore its local fit. I'm arguing that we may run into the opposite bind of including so much context in category definitions that we will have no comparative categories at all. Although each differentiated individual is unique and necessarily appropriate to his historical circumstances, the assumption that general principles consequently do not apply is illogical. So therefore, Lata may be something more universal, such as schizophrenia or Tourette's, and not something culture specific. If we cannot compare apples and oranges because they are too different, can we compare Valencia oranges with navel oranges? One navel orange with another? One navel with itself at some other time or circumstance? So in other words, the problem here is over contextualizing. Some say one of the reasons why this exclusionist sort of mentality or this exclusionist paradigm regarding culture-bound syndromes, and in fact the very idea of culture-bound syndromes itself, is so popular has to do with a classic debate that is raged in anthropology for a long time, and it pits two sides against one another. One side is the sort of interpretive approach, an interpretive understanding of culture behavior, and the other is a sort of causal approach, a more scientific causal approach to human behavior. And of course we can see why these two approaches would be at odds with one another, and the sort of the first one was the term I used, the interpretive approach. Some people use the term symbolic approach. Actually encourages the researcher to be a bit more culture specific and to look at cultural reasons behind things and to pretty much contextualize everything within the confines of a cultural ideology, whereas on the other side of the table the sort of causal scientific approach encourages us to pretty much see one occurrence of something as maybe a specific manifestation of a more general phenomenon. For example, Lata may be schizophrenia. And there's also a similar sort of issue that pits, and this issue sort of grows out of the other one, that pits so-called ethnocentrist on the one hand against xenocentrist. Ethnocentrist, ethnocentrists, from the word ethnocentrism, and then xenocentrism, that's with an X by the way, xenocentrism, xenocentrism. So the ethnocentrist or ethnocentrism versus xenocentrism. The ethnocentrist approach tends to contextualize the discussion of all sickness in the language of experimental science. And of course, the primary drawback of that approach is, well, I'll use a fancy word, epistemological arrogance. In other words, perhaps that approach is a bit too arrogant. It's just looking at things from a very strict causal scientific point of view without any consideration of cultural issues. So that's the one drawback of the ethnocentric approach to sickness, epistemological arrogance. I'll spell it for you. epistemological, epistemological arrogance. Now on the other side of the table, what about xenocentrism, or the approach of the xenocentrist? Well, of course, the primary problem there is with the focus strictly on sickness as a cultural phenomenon. The problem there is that it makes universal understanding practically impossible, because after all, you're so lost in the specifics of this place and that place, etc., that any sort of general understanding is not possible. So it makes a universal understanding almost impossible.